there's been so much activity now in Alberta and so much concern about the possibility of having our eastern slopes riddled with open pit coal mines. And when you travel out there, which I know you both have, and you see the way the place is being managed, all of the different activities it's almost lawless out there when you have a look at it. And the kind of clear-cut logging that's happening now, like they've escalated the annual cut, like I think it's 3 times.
Yeah, 32% increase.
32%. So, I'd like to hear from you guys what you think this is doing for our very precious wildlife and watershed and wilderness out there.
Well, I think first of all, at this point in time, there has been 20 cumulative effects assessments done in the eastern slopes by government, a bit by industry, by conservation groups. And remarkably, those cumulative effects assessments tell the same story, that we've created and are creating an even busier place in the eastern slopes, a place that nudges up against critical ecological thresholds and beyond. And I think it gets to the point where we don't realize that yet because very few people live or navigate through the eastern slopes. But when you take a simple Google search of the eastern slopes, you can see the impacts. And it reminds me of the metaphor of, imagine having a house and you invite more and more people to stay in your house until the refrigerator is empty and the toilets are plugged and the air smells like sweat and dirty socks. The bedrooms are stuffed full. You might invite a kid in with a drum set. And you have to ask yourself, at what point was it not a very comfortable living association? And that's the question I think we have to ask ourselves about what's happening in the eastern slopes. And not just what has happened or is happening, but the prospectus for what's going to happen in the future based on the trends.
Yeah. If you take even a longer perspective, glacial ice sheets retreated off this landscape 10, 12,000 years ago. And I like to think of the eastern slopes as a disturbance landscape. I don't see anything wrong with disturbance, but in those last several thousand years, it's been insects that come and go. It's been fires. It's been flood. You look at lodgepole pine, one of the most common tree species on the eastern slope. It's a disturbance-based tree species, as is trembling aspen. So there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a requirement to have disturbance. But since Europeans have arrived, against that backdrop of having disturbance, and in a climate change world, even having more disturbance with insects and fire and droughts because of climate change. But if you go back a couple hundred years, we've seen these waves of human land use. Probably one of the first one was trapping. And we had a lot of mining way back, just hundreds of small coal mines, of course, in the eastern slopes going back 150 years ago. And then forestry, and then agriculture, and then energy, transportation, rural residential, all the acreage owners. And these things just keep adding up and up, just like Lorne was describing. And so now we have a level of disturbance that is completely outside of the range of natural variability. And so the landscape is transformed in composition. It's so badly fragmented. We're literally loving it to death. And somewhere along the line, it seems like we forgot that the key objective of this landscape, going back conversations over 100 years ago, was watershed protection. It was supposed to produce vast quantities of high quality water. Mm-hmm. And now we're just loving it to death with every single land use that we can think of. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, we just drove across the Old Man Dam this morning, and I would say it's down about 30 feet from the high water mark at least. And of course, it's filling up with silt. And we know where the silt's coming from, right? It has to be coming from the mountains. Where else could it be coming from? And why are we getting all this silt? It's because of the logging operations. At least the biggest part of it is it's coming from these massive clear cuts that we're getting out there now. And we need to start thinking about a new strategy for the eastern slopes.
Yeah, it's funny, we're on the eve of a federal government's plan for critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And yet, as part of that, we're not thinking about what some critical infrastructure is, like the places that protect and provide us with water. And this of course harkens back to, Brad's point about the watersheds of the eastern slopes, and how early federal civil servants, late 1800s, saw the eastern slopes as the source of water, and came to the conclusion that if we didn't protect those headwaters and the source of the water, it would be very difficult to people the prairies. Mm-hmm. So, that came about early, and in the 70s was the institution of the East Slopes Policy, which was supposed to enshrine watershed protection as the most important feature of the eastern slopes. And unfortunately, we have deviated significantly from that, essentially turning the eastern slopes into a warehouse to be raided, rather than a temple to be applauded and protected. And it's time that we started thinking about these things while there are still the opportunities to protect some of those essential ecological features and ecological goods and services, water being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Like industry and government, the words used in even contemporary legislation policy, again, whether it's government or industry side, still tacitly recognizes the importance of these slopes for water. So, I mean, that's a good thing. But where we're struggling is the hard conversations about if these slopes is about water and carbon and biodiversity and everything else that comes from protecting the watershed, can you have land uses? And if so, which ones? And equally importantly, how much and what kind of best management practices? So the rhetoric is still there. These slopes is there to protect water. I hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. But the water, both in terms of water quality and water quantity, has deteriorated profoundly. So we're obviously not doing a good job of protecting it. But what we hear is, you can have forestry as long as you adopt best management practices. And you can have the oil and gas sector as long as they adopt best management practices. And same with livestock and recreation and rural residential. But when you actually get out there and look, not that there aren't some good players, but when you get out and look at the entire landscape and see how the transportation networks is being built and the culverts and the way in which we're logging, what kind of rotation ages, how much residual green trees there are, how close we're allowed to get to creeks, particularly the small ones, you can see that we're not logging or in many cases conducting other land uses in a way that actually demonstrates that water is important. And what's the value of having best management practices unless you're deploying them and then enforcing them, and then if someone doesn't abide by them, basically penalizing them. So we do not have a system that actually requires, I think, the deployment and the maintenance and enforcement of best management practices. On a very, very small chunk of Alberta, it plays an absolutely inordinate role in providing water quality and quantity.
It seems to me that, riffing off what you've said, Brad, is that the more we talk about the protection of the eastern slopes, the less we do.
Yeah.
And there seems to be this, enduring narrative that there are all these protective and regulatory mechanisms in place. And to a degree they are, but if they're not used, it really is of no effect. And I think this is why conservation organizations like the Alberta Wilderness Association and the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society have taken a long, hard look at particularly timber harvest And although the data isn't complete yet, because some of that work is still ongoing, even the most minimal protective mechanisms in the form of the timber harvest operating ground rules are only met about half the time. And these are minimum protective mechanisms. So, when you talk about sediment and the infilling of the Old Man Reservoir, it's clear that whatever the mechanisms are that are in place aren't being used to even do a minimal amount of protective work to do things like stop erosion from logging clear cuts and logging roads and off-highway vehicle activity, not to mention the prospect of mining coming in on top of all of that.
There's an example of a different way of managing this, the mountains and the eastern slopes directly south of us across the international border. It extends from the border essentially all the way to Lincoln, Montana, which if you transferred that amount of landscape onto our eastern slopes here would be basically from Waterton to Banff, or maybe even a little more, plus both sides of the Continental Divide. And what they did way back in the 1960s, and I know you guys know that, is a handful of dedicated conservationists got together and formulated a bill, a federal bill, the wilderness bill, and got that approved and passed, and now it protects millions of acres of wilderness in the United States. And if you were to go to the Bob Marshall, which you probably have, and to pack in there, backpack or something, you would see an entirely different mechanism for managing the watershed, for looking after the wildlife, and for looking after the wilderness. And the question I have, and I've asked it over and over again, is why can't we do that here? We are at we're at almost the end game for the eastern slopes in terms of wildlife. The number of endangered species keeps growing all the time, fisheries, birds, big animals. And essentially we keep hearing the same thing, that the eastern slopes are just a warehouse of resources for us to use out there. And there's, as you both said, there's more to come. There's all of these critical minerals that are on the way, and numerous other things. So what is the end game for the eastern slopes unless we reverse the course and get back to a philosophy of loving this landscape and protecting it for what it gives us, which is wildlife, wilderness, and watershed, three critical things to our lifestyle.
Yeah, my sense is, and certainly the response of Albertans to the prospect of coal mining, was swift, and about 75% of Albertans came out negative towards coal mining in the eastern slopes. And I think that substantiates the thought that Albertans view the eastern slopes as being part of our DNA.
Yeah.
And so part of that is, part of the changes that have to happen is somehow accentuating that love of the eastern slopes, which comes through engagement and awareness and knowledge, leading to some legislative changes that would provide a much greater level of protection. And so on both parts, I think one of the things that we're up against is this phenomena of shifting benchmarks, where everyone thinks that they come into the world with a full pie's worth of resources, not realizing that there's only a slice left, and we're continuing to slice that thin slice up. And so part of this is giving people the sense that we are at a critical moment in terms of the footprint that we've created on the eastern slopes, and what that footprint means in terms of water quality, fish and wildlife populations, particularly species at risk, about the resilience of these landscapes, about the services that they provide, and can't continue to provide in the face of that footprint. And I think that's critical to starting the process of people saying, what we're doing isn't good enough. We need to do better. We need to look in the past at the Eastern Slopes policy, and we need to formulate a new way of thinking about the Eastern Slopes that substantiates what we recognize as part of our DNA.
You know, furthermore, from what Lorne was talking about with shifting baselines, and Mike, you'd mentioned that the Eastern Slopes are so special. And in a comparative way to other parts of Alberta, they absolutely are. And so we might talk about there's so much here that we need to protect. And I agree with that. I think it's one of the most special biomes in all of Alberta. But if you take an empirical, kind of science-based approach and you back up just the last couple hundred years, and you, for example, just look at wild mammal populations, our native mammals, from weasels on up, because I don't really have any good data on rodents, but from weasels on up. So all the members of the mustelid family, the weasel family, and deer family, and canids, and ursids, and cervids, all of our large mammals. And if you look at their biomass today compared to, say, 250 years ago, in southwest Alberta, so just, you know, the mountains, the east slopes, and out onto a bit into the prairies, as a percentage of the total mammal biomass, we're down 96%. So from my perspective, there aren't any. I mean, if I came home with a 4% grade in an exam, I think my dad would say, you got all the answers wrong.
Yeah.
So it's not like we've lost 10 or 20%. Now, what's interesting is that the total amount of mammal biomass in southwest Alberta has gone up 2.5 times.
Yeah.
So native mammals have gone down 96% in southwest Alberta, but total amount of mammals, and it's in humans, it's in pets, and it's primarily in livestock.
Yeah.
So and the same general story is told with birds, with the data's not as good, and I suspect would be told with insects too, and I suspect with fish, because a lot of our fish in these slopes are not native fish. But I think Albertans still see it as a mug or cup that's still largely full. And if you back up in time, it's primarily gone. But there's still vestiges of it there. And so there's still an opportunity. But our attitude seems to be, rather than one of respectful ignorance, which is we don't understand these systems well enough, so we just have to treat them gently and maybe just have a little bit of land use. We have this perceived intelligence approach, which is, we know it all. We can figure this out. There's win-win-wins. You know, we can come at it with an engineering approach, and yeah, I guess forestry might have some problems, but we know how to fix that. And same with cattle grazing, and the same with recreation and off-highway vehicles, and we can just manipulate it, and at the end of the day, everyone can have everything. And it's just so patently wrong and incorrect. And the example you said in Bob Marshall is one which is, it's a precious system. We'll let natural disturbances largely drive it, and we're going to leave the human footprint as small as possible. And it's done relatively well.
I just want to add the aquatic side to this, because that's my background, and so I have a perceived bias in this. When every native trout species, from the border with Montana all the way to where the Eastern Slopes heads into BC, every one of those species is a species at risk, either threatened or endangered. And so that should be a series of big flashing red lights that we've done something to the watershed. And in fact, I looked at the historic abundance of bull trout in southwestern Alberta compared with the present abundance. And this is data now almost 30 years old. What I found was a 70% loss of bull trout range. And almost half of the watersheds that I investigated, bull trout had gone missing in. So again, big warning signals. With cutthroat trout, it's even worse. Cutthroat trout were native to the Old Man and Bow watersheds, and they're down to about 5% of their historic range and abundance. So here we have a situation where And I like to think of those native trout as the indicators, as the bellwethers, maybe our report cards on how well we're managing the watershed. And if they are the indicators, we've failed miserably. That your dad would have to admit that as well, that we've failed miserably. And so we do have these mechanisms to measure how well or how poorly we're doing. But we're failing to use those appropriately to guide our landscape management.
Imagine you were in Alberta, say 400 years ago, and you had some relatives in England and they wanted to come over and visit you. So let's say you're a white person and there's First Nation communities, let's say 400 or 500 years ago, but you're here and you've got a relative and they want to come over, Mike, to visit you, let's say, and you're going to show them a grizzly bear, right? But you only have so much time, and you're saying, okay, maybe you can visit them, you're on horseback or whatever. So you've got the alpine, you've got the subalpine, you've got the foothills, you've got the prairie. But you wanted to show them a lot of bears. You would take them to the prairies, because that's where almost all the bears were, the highest density. Next would be the lower foothills. Then it would be the upper foothills. And then it'd be montane, and then it'd be alpine. And they would have seen a lot of bears, especially if you would have gone to the prairies. But now, say someone from England wanted to visit and you wanted to show them grizzly bears now, I don't think you'd take them to the prairies. I mean, generally there's a very thin piece of habitat, and it's the worst of the grizzly bear habitat, but we think it's the best because that's all that's left. And it's that kind of long temporal view that reminds us of just how much these landscapes have changed. Same with bull trout. I mean, it would have been amazing bull trout populations in the prairies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, both bull trout and cutthroat trout distribution in both the Bow and the Oldman rivers would have been, for cutthroat and bull trout, below Calgary and down to Lethbridge. And so if you just think about the river length that involves and the fact they're not present there anymore and that they've started to wink out in others, as an indication. And this is not a historical artifact. This is something that's happening today. The cutthroat trout of Trout Creek, little tributary to Willow Creek that flows off the eastern flank of the Porcupine Hills. There's a photograph in the Glenbow archives of 3 anglers and a child, which suggests they were just there for the day. And there is a pile of cutthroat trout that I've estimated would be probably somewhere around 100 pounds of cutthroat trout. Well, cutthroat trout essentially disappeared from Trout Creek just in the last 5 years. The same with Crow's Nest Creek and East Crow's Nest Creek, tributaries to Crow's Nest Lake. They had native cutthroat populations, probably had bull trout spawning in the lower reaches of them, a combination of channelization to accommodate the highway, and coal mining has now meant that cutthroat trout are no longer present in those systems, and in fact there are no trout left in those systems. So that happened literally overnight, and within our memory, and just in the last few years. So this suggests, as you pointed out, Mike, how tenuous our grip on some of these treasures of the eastern slopes are, and why we need to act with speed and boldness now if we want to retain any of that native complement and the habitat that supported them.
So we've got a provincial policy that's come out, a premier who's fairly recently said that she would like to see our provincial population double in a very short period of time. And so if she were to have her way, we would move from 4.5 to say 9 million people. Certainly there'd be a lot more people living in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor and moving west into Canmore. But just think of what that would mean in terms of demand for water. It would at least double. It'd actually be more than doubling, because every year the average person is using more water per capita. the demand for meat, the demand for recreation. Just think of all the hundreds of thousands of rural residential acreage owners that would be pushing up further into the east slopes. Demand for energy, so, and then crops. So not surprising, we have so many conversations. We've got to hold back more water in more and more reservoirs. We've got to drill more conventional and unconventional hydrocarbons. We need more livestock. We need several new canmores, apparently, because this is wonderful stuff. All of it, which comes hand in hand with the growth economy. So growth is just unbelievably good, apparently. But a lot of Albertans see the East Slopes as an absolutely beautiful place to live, recreate, buy a house. And it's such a thin corridor of habitat that is, in many ways, just a vestige of what it used to be, but there's still something remarkably precious, and it still can roll water off in amazing quality if managed properly, and it's not being managed that way.
Yeah, Brad, you're right. I mean, we still have this narrative that we've got a frontier.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, the frontier ended probably 130 years ago, but we still suffer from this delusion that we have this full pie's worth of resources that we can develop, and that we have the know-how to actually develop them at the speed that we're developing them without harming the other assets of the Eastern Slopes. And it's just false. It's just wrong, and it belies a certain arrogance that we know enough that we can do this.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a question for both of you. If you had the opportunity to present a vision to Albertans for what management of the Eastern Slopes should be and could be, what would it be?
Boy, Mike, you don't have a softball question, do you?
No, of course not.
It involves, I think, having a vision for where we've come from, and recognizing what we've lost, and what we have the facility and the knowledge to restore back to a functioning system that's resilient, that has these indicator species of health, like bull trout and cutthroat and grizzlies and others, that provides us with reliable supplies of water, both quantity and quality. And once we have those parameters, then we can ask the question, what other sorts of things can we do in the Eastern Slopes? But we entered it with this, the answer is logging and mining and off-highway vehicle activity and in all forms of industrial recreation. And then stopped and said, now what was the question to this? Well, we need to start with where we want to be, what Albertans think the Eastern Slope should be about, what the aspects are that we want to maintain, and not just for recreation. And I want to make this clear, is that the Eastern Slopes are more than just recreation. They are the lifeblood of Alberta. Somewhere around 80% of Albertans rely on water from the Eastern Slopes. That's for domestic uses, industrial purposes, for irrigation, agriculture, and so forth. And we can't proceed into the future thinking that we can supply everyone with everything all the time and not suffer some losses. And those losses are already evident in the Eastern Slopes. And we've got to somehow turn the hands of time backwards to the point where that landscape is robust enough to help us into the future without destroying it for our future.
Mike, I think your question was actually asked about 100 years ago when the East Slopes was called a federal dominion forest. And it was managed, as I understand it, by the federal government. And they transferred the management rights to the province. And it's worth going back and reading those documents, because they state explicitly, and they were basically asking the question you asked, is what is the role of these slopes? And the answer emphatically was water. Water's critical and will be in the future. And I think Albertans need to remind themselves, as people like Dave Sachin, Dave Schindler, John Pomeroy and others, Bill Donahue, have shown that during the period of time the three of us have been alive, we have lived and visited southwest Alberta at a time where water has been generally very reliable. And in a landscape that has intensity and magnitudes of floods unlike anything the three of us have experienced. But we don't think of it that way. But given that history, water is absolutely critical, as Lorne was saying. And the Fed said, here it is, we all agree, it's about protecting water, both water quality and water quantity. And if that landscape is rolling off the appropriate flow rates of water and of good quality, that means we're doing a good job of land uses. And it's not. And that landscape is so heavily fragmented and so disturbed. And whether it be road crossings or culverts or just cut blocks or mine sites or the rapidly growing footprint of the off-road vehicle sector, or all of these land uses, rural residential, and all the riparian habitat that's been destroyed, we're not treating it with that responsibility. But if we could agree somehow that water is probably the most important resource, and if we managed it right, biodiversity would come along for the ride. But this landscape isn't, these slopes, whether we like it or not, is now an industrial landscape. But it still has vestiges of what it used to be. And the window of opportunity to reverse that is very small and closing quickly, I think.
You know, the big corporations pretty much get what they want from our government, at least that's my opinion. And what I'm wondering is, do you think there's any political way forward that we can make a paradigm shift for the eastern slopes? You know, we know that like 70% of Albertans don't want open pit coal mines, and 68% want some form of protection for the eastern slopes. So there's a population mass out there that would actually, and I believe politically, be in favor of reversing these trends if we could do it. But the question that I struggle with, is there any possible way of doing that politically nowadays?
That's a really good question, Mike, and I don't know if our ecological and environmental arguments are finding a home. But I think they might find a home if we did what's called full cost accounting, to toll up not only what the benefits are of clear-cut logging and industrial strength recreation and coal mining, but what the costs are. And what those costs are over the long term in terms of increasing the propensity for droughts to occur and to be prolonged because we haven't dealt with our natural reservoirs in the eastern slopes appropriately. How floods have been intensified in terms of frequency and magnitude, which, if you were in downtown Calgary in 2013, you would understand, the aspects of that. And I think one of the things that we need to do is actually look beyond our boundaries, particularly over the footprint of logging, which is the largest footprint of industrial activity we have in the eastern slopes. If we look at the research that's going on in BC, where downstream communities like Grand Forks and others have suffered serious flooding as a consequence of the footprint of logging, we might have the beginnings of an incentive to think more about what are the costs of some of these industrial activities as opposed to what the benefits are, which in many cases might be ephemeral. A lot of money's being made by a few people, but there's a lot of people having to pay and will have to pay significantly into the future because of those activities. That might actually have some resonance with constituents, who are the taxpayers who will have to pay the bills, and inevitably with the politicians who should be responding to their constituents rather than to corporations.
Well, you know, I think oil and gas is kind of getting off the hook here real easy.
Sure.
Considering that, you know, they overheated the economy in Alberta for about, I don't know, 5 decades or so. But now people are suddenly beginning to realize, wait a minute, where are these big corporations and what are they leaving us behind? They made a lot of money for their shareholders, but what's left? We've got hundreds of sour gas wells out here on the eastern slopes on our public land that nobody's going to be responsible for except us at the end of the day, right? And we didn't all make money out of the oil and gas industry.
Another example, best management practices, right? So every one of those wells would have been part of some conversation, Mike, about, you know, we're gonna execute a certain play and drill a certain number of wells, and they'll have a productive lifespan, and then we'll put them to bed, and then we'll reclaim them, and then they'll be off the landscape, and we'll put them back in natural habitat, right? And it's not to say that that hasn't happened on occasion, but we can all so easily point, and it's not, you know, at the scale of Alberta, we're not talking about dozens or hundreds or thousands. We're talking about many tens of thousands
Yes.
of abandoned wells. And, you know, it comes back to that perceived intelligence. Like, we've got to, you know, if you're an Albertan that says we've got a great regulatory environment and we're adopting a suite of best management practices and it's not a problem, then you're not worried. And so to answer your question, it's kind of the ultimate acid test, I think, of Alberta as to whether Albertans really view it as a me here now. You know, it's about me, not about you. It's about right here. It's not about regional considerations. And I'm not really too concerned about my grandkids because it's about me. I think too many Albertans act that way. Alternatively, we could be walking away from a me here now type of philosophy to ones that it's about regional landscapes. It's about a broad suite of indicators. It's not me, it's the community, and it's not just Mike, you're in my generation, and Lawrence, it's about our grandkids. And I don't see a lot of evidence that Albertans actually reward governments that want to talk about that different type of scale. But if they don't, we're losing something very precious.
I would agree, Mike, the oil and gas industry has overheated our economy, but more importantly, they've overheated our world.
Yeah.
And
both.
that is a cost that the
Absolutely.
rest of us are bearing and will continue to bear into the future. I would hope that that voices like ours, coupled with other voices, will resonate with Albertans at all levels, political, corporate, and others, to recognize how crucial our management of the eastern slopes is, to recognize our failures, and to understand in terms of critical infrastructure how important the eastern slopes are to our lives and livelihoods, and that we start making better decisions faster about where we want to take the eastern slopes, because the time is rapidly approaching where the opportunities will slip through our fingers.
Yeah, maybe to complement Lorne, I would say, and much of my career has been in chronicling, documenting the curves of land use and natural capital in Alberta over the last 100 years. And in terms of land use commodities, whether it be the amount of oil and gas or bitumen or coal that we've produced, amount of cattle we've produced, number of people we have, our logging, annual alba cut, almost all of these have grown at an exponential rate. They're all driven by growth. And we are quite clearly locked into an economic paradigm that has to have growth every single year. And in fact, the evidence tells us that's what we've had in Alberta. And industry and government thinks strongly that Alberta needs to continue growing. It's a growth place. But the natural capital of Alberta and the size of this province hasn't changed. What we've done is we have exponentially drained the capital, the carbon, the wildlife, the forests of this province. And until such time as Albertans openly have a candid conversation about the liabilities of a growth economy, because we certainly celebrate the benefits of it, but we walk away and ignore the liabilities of everything has to continue to grow. And we have seen what has happened to Alberta in the last 100 years based on a century of growth of all of our natural resource productions. So that's what I would hope is Alberta wakes up to understanding that our current economic model and what it does to our land uses is taking us in a very dangerous direction.
Anybody that's walked up on the mountainside here and looked out on the prairies, smelled the pine forest and seen bald eagles flying over and possibly seen a grizzly bear, knows that this is a special place in Alberta. It's one of the best places there is in Alberta. And the idea, when you're up there, it's not hard to see that there's something else going on and that there's a vast industrial footprint that's happening. Almost every valley in the south here is roaded, has well sites, there's exponential clear cutting going on. This special place is gradually being cut to ribbons. And we need to change, we need to make a paradigm shift here, and we need to do it soon, just as these two professionals have told you. And the answer to that, in my opinion, is that we need new legislation, that land use plans are failing us, and that we need to have the consent of the majority of Albertans to create a whole new legislative bill for the eastern slopes that not only protects it but restores it. And that means bringing back or trying to bring back some of the species that are missing now, like beavers and bison and animals that are critical to the ecosystem. And we can do that. The thing is, we have all the potential to do that, and if there was ever a time to do it, it's right now.